Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS. Let's get started and look into the first article. The first article is speaking about beamstick. Before we understand what is the author trying to convey, let us understand some important factual data with respect to beamstick. Initially, when beamstick was formed, it did not have the 7 countries. It was formed with the formation of 4 countries, which included Bangladesh, India, Sri Lanka, and Thailand, which is why it is called as BIST Economic Cooperation. Eventually, Myanmar was added into it, and in the year 2004, we also have Nepal and Bhutan added to this economic cooperation. So remember, as of now, we have about 7 countries, which include Bangladesh, India, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Thailand, Bhutan, and Nepal. Where is it headquartered? It is headquartered in Dhaka. This can be very important from the preliminary examination point of view. Also remember, this organization came into being through the Bangkok Declaration. Why are we discussing this? That is because Sri Lanka will be hosting a virtual meet of the BeamStick. When we speak about BeamStick, it has about 14 pillars which it concentrates on. What are those? 1. Trade and investment, transport and communication, energy, tourism, technology, fisheries, agriculture, public health, poverty alleviation, counter-terrorism and transnational crime, environment and disaster management, people-to-people contact, cultural cooperation, and climate change. So as they speak about these pillars in this economic cooperation, they give vague statements, they make general statements, but there are some existing problems which they have to identify and come up with the solutions is what is the author trying to convey. Recently, we also had the Bay of Bengal Maritime Dialogue. This was a program initiated by Pathfinder Foundation and Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. So remember, this was jointly organized as a 1.5 track diplomacy. When we speak about diplomacy, there are different tracks of diplomacy. We have track 1 diplomacy, we have track 2 diplomacy, we also have track 1.5 diplomacy. So as part of the assignment, you have to put on the comment section, what is this track 1, what is this track 2, what is this track 1.5. Remember, the Pathfinder Foundation and the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue initiated this program, and this happens to be a 1.5 track diplomacy. Let us try and understand what was this program all about. This happened to be an initiative taken up by this particular organization. So what do? They bring multiple experts, climate change experts, dignitaries, luminaries from all these countries, and ultimately they discuss about multiple parameters. They spoke about maritime issues, they spoke about environmental protection, they also spoke about fishing issues in this particular area. So all that they discussed was that there are some issues in the Bay of Bengal region. We have to identify it, and ultimately we have to come up with the standard operating procedure, said the Bay of Bengal Maritime Dialogue. So what had happened? These people came up together, they tried to identify what are the problems, and ultimately they came up with some recommendation in reference to the Bay of Bengal Maritime Dialogue. Added to it, the author also goes on to say that when it comes to the Bay of Bengal region, it has its own significant factors. What are these significant factors? Bay of Bengal is home to a large network of beautiful yet fragile estuaries, mangrove forests of around 15,792 square kilometer, coral reefs of about 8,471 square kilometer, seagrass meadows, and mass nesting sites of sea turtles. This is one advantage. Added to it, the Bay of Bengal is an important source of natural resource for a coastal population of approximately 185 million people. The fishermen population alone is estimated to be about 3.7 million, with an annual fish catch of around 6 million tons, constituting about 7% of the world's catch and valued at about 4 billion US dollars. So in the Bay of Bengal region, there are a lot of significant factors. We would be able to generate economic activities. We should identify other areas where we can improvise on it, for example tourism and other natural resources, and ultimately we should be able to have sustainable growth, says the author. In spite of these advantages, there are concerns with respect to the Bay of Bengal region. What are the concerns? The first is in reference to loss of the vegetation. We know for the fact that mangroves are present in the Bay of Bengal region, but what is happening of late? There is loss of mangrove areas which is estimated at about 0.4% to about 1.7%, and coral reefs are also getting reduced, and this is at about 0.7%. So basically there is an annual loss of mangroves, there is destruction of the mangroves because of the man-made factors, and some could also be because of the natural factors. What are the man-made factors? We have been increasing the agricultural activity, industrial activity, we are removing all the trees that are present in this particular area, and as a result of the man-made causes, the mangroves have been reducing over a period of time. The second major problem is in reference to the fishing. The Food and the Agriculture Organization of the United Nations says that the Bay of Bengal is one of the IUU fishing hotspots in the Asia Pacific region. What do we understand by IUU? Basically, it is nothing but illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing. What do we understand by IUU fishing? When we speak about illegal fishing, what exactly happens? Let's say, for example, there is a country. The country has laws with respect to that particular country with respect to fishing. If there are fishermen who are violating the national laws, that is called as illegal fishing, or there might be international laws with respect to fishing as well. In case there are fishermen violating the international laws, that is called as illegal fishing. So there are national and international laws. If these laws are getting violated by the fishermen with respect to the fishing, that is called as illegal fishing. Then we have something called as the unreported fishing. What is this unreported fishing? Let's say, for example, a fisherman goes to a particular region. He takes the fishes from that particular area. Either in this particular case he underreports or he misreports. Let's say, for example, he would have caught around 1 ton of fish, but what would he say? He says that it might be less than 1 ton, or he might not even report it to the government officials. That is what is called as unreported fishing. Either he underreports or he does not even report to the government agencies, which is called as the unreported fishing. Added to it, there is something called as the unregulated fishing, where there is no applicable conservation or the management measures in that particular area. So this may result in what is called as IUU fishing. So according to the Food and Agricultural Organization, the Bay of Bengal region is a IUU fishing hotspot, which means there is illegal fishing, there is underreported fishing, there is unregulated fishing, which means there is no sustainability which is taken into picture with respect to the fishing in the Bay of Bengal region. So when we speak about IUU fishing, what happens? There might be people who might be running into this particular area without the license for catch. There might be people who would have been given a prescribed quota for the fishes, but they have exceeded that particular quota. They are either making false reports or they're not even giving the reports with respect to the fish catch, which is why we have the Food and Agriculture Organization, which says that this particular region is a hotspot because of illegal, unreported issues in this particular area. The third is in reference to the disasters that have been haunting the Bay of Bengal region. One is in reference to the natural disasters, the other is in reference to the man-made disasters. What happens in the natural disaster? Let's say, for example, the tsunami that happens, or let's say, for example, we have the cyclonic storms that takes place. These are the natural disasters, but what is giving impetus to this is the man-made causes. So what are these man-made causes? The climate change is aggregated, is exaggerated because of the man-made causes, and at the same time, yes, the sea level might be happening, which is a natural phenomena, but who is giving impetus to it? It is the anthropogenic factors. So on one side, what we also have is increasing disasters in this particular area. It can be because of the sea level rise, or it can be because of the cyclic storms, or because of all these issues. It is the people who are bound to suffer. So the third major reason haunting this particular part of Bay of Bengal region is the disasters. The fourth major concern in the Bay of Bengal region happens to be the security threats. What are these security threats? This might be because of the terrorism or the piracy related issue, or it can also be tensions between the countries. How tensions between the country? Let's say, for example, we have Sri Lanka. Let's take the example of India-Sri Lanka relations. What do fishermen from India do? They cross the borders of India. They also venture into the waters of Sri Lanka, and ultimately these fishermen are even caught by the naval officers of Sri Lanka, and we have a diplomatic clash between these two countries. So on one side there can be terrorism issue, there can be piracy issue, or tensions between countries as well. One such example is what we just discussed. So because we have limited cooperation between our countries, that is amongst all these BIMSTEC countries, what we are witnessing is all these issues in the Bay of Bengal region. See, author in this particular case goes on to say that because we have limited cooperation, what we have to do is increase the cooperation amongst all the countries. So what should we do? Let's say for example, we have some of the premier institutions, we have excellent scientists as well. These scientists and premier institutions usually interact with the Western countries. All these scientists that we have to interact, and if we have some of the best practices that are taken up from the West, from these scientists and the premier institutions in these countries, the same will have to be discussed so that we can mitigate the impact of this natural and man-made issue in the Bay of Bengal region, says the author. So the author in this particular case goes on to say that we have to strengthen the fisheries management, promote sustainable fishing methods, establish protected areas and develop framework to prevent and manage pollution, especially industrial and agricultural waste as well as the oil spills. In order to take care of our environment, what we require is certain rules and regulations which all countries have to come together. They have to ensure that there is an institution that is established, and this institution should continuously monitor the environmental protection paradigm, says the author, for which what we can make use of is the modern technology, and we can also infuse a lot of money into the scientific research. So the scientific research material and the money pumped into the modern technology will ultimately help to progress in the Bay of Bengal region, says the author. Added to it, we have one of the programs called as the Bay of Bengal program, which is initiated by an intergovernmental organization that is based from Chennai. What does it work on? It works on promoting the sustainable fishing. This has to be imported into the concept of the BIMSTEC. Then we have a Bay of Bengal large marine ecosystem project, which is also being launched by the FAO with the funding from the Global Environmental Facility and others as well. Such measures will also have to be taken by the BIMSTEC countries. With special emphasis to the fishing sector, the author says that international vessel tracking system, making it mandatory for vessels to be equipped with automatic identification system trackers, and establishing regional fishing vessel registry system and publishing vessel license list, increasing monitoring, control and surveillance within these areas, establishing the guidelines between the countries, and finally improving the implementation of joint regional patrols should all be taken up with reference to fishing, says the author. So what is that we understand? That there is a lot of potential when it comes to the Bay of Bengal region. The same will have to be identified. There are some hiccups in this particular area, so this has to be analyzed. The challenges have to be addressed, and if we are able to address all these challenges, ultimately these countries will be able to generate profits, and there will be employment generation as well, ultimately leading to the growth of the people as well as the country in this part of the economic cooperation. It is this that we have to understand in reference to this article. Now let's look into the next article. This article says the Startup India Initiative. First, let us try and understand what is this program all about, and then understand what is the article trying to convey. When we speak about the Startup India Initiative, this is an important government program that was launched back in the year 2016 with an aim to promote and support the startups in India by providing the bank finances. So what exactly happened? We did have the startup ecosystem earlier, but more impetus was given to the startup ecosystem where finances were provided, and all the mechanisms that were acting as the impediments for the starting of the startups were ultimately eliminated by the government of India. For example, the license large, the land permissions, foreign investment proposals, environment clearances were to have taken a lot of time for these clearances. These were ultimately reduced so that the startup ecosystem was enhanced in our country. So this would ultimately create an ecosystem, transform India, whereby the job seekers will become the job creators. So what are the pillars of the Startup India program? Providing funding support and incentives to various startups of the country, provide industry academia partnership and incubation, And finally, simplification and hand-holding are some of the main pillars when it comes to the startup. Why are we discussing this? That is because we have the Minister for Commerce and Industry who recently said that there are about 65,000 startups in our country. And there was another study that was conducted by Dublin City University which critically evaluates about the success story of the startups and what are the hiccups and the concerns with respect to the startups. So what are the advantages with respect to the Startup India initiative? When we speak about the Startup India initiative, it has been able to address the entrepreneurial disparities. What do we understand by this? The government has initiated this particular program. With this particular program, number of villages, number of tier 2 and tier 3 cities which had not seen the entrepreneurship spirit are now seeing the entrepreneurship spirit, which means to say the job seekers are themselves becoming a job creators. So Startup India's networking, training and mentoring services as well as the entrepreneurship outreach campaigns in cities help to address India's regional entrepreneurial disparities. So what was focused only in the cities, the same was also spread to tier 2 and tier 3 cities. So those people who were migrating to urban areas looking for job opportunities, they started restricting themselves to the very same region and they themselves became the job creators. So there was a regional disparity which the Startup India initiative was able to comparatively reduce. When we look into the state governments, much prior to launch of this particular program, there were state governments which had favored number of policies when it comes to the startup. So before the launch of this particular program, only about 4 states had specific policies with respect to the startups. But however, after this particular program was initiated in 2016, by the month of December 2019, 23 states and union territories formulated a dedicated startup policy. So the central government has given impetus to it and the state governments have further given encouragement, whereby what we will have is the startup and the entrepreneurship spirit in the country, which is supported both by the central government as well as the state government. However, we do have a lot of concerns when it comes to this particular program. What are these concerns? When we speak about the concentration of the startups, where are they focused on? They are primarily present in Mumbai, Bengaluru and Delhi NCR region. These are the 3 places where most of the startups are present. And when we look into the statistics, it accounted for 93% of all funding raised between 2014 and 19. So if most of these startups are only present in these places, what about the other places? The other places will also bound to suffer. This means that there is heavy concentration of these startups only in the mega cities and it is not further split into other regions is the first major concern. The second major concern is it has increased economic inequality and it might hinder emergence of entrepreneurs from industries other than those belonging to the clusters. What do we mean by it? Let's say for example, we have these startups from Mumbai, Bengaluru and also from Delhi. So what would happen whenever there is a development of these startups, there will be ancillary development of other industries as well. Let's say for example, when there is a startup that comes up in a particular area, there might be development of other industries in and around the startup area. So what would happen? Only these areas will develop over a period of time and ultimately people also start migrating to this particular region. But for those other regions where the startups are not present, what would happen? The taxes may not flow, there will be no development of other ancillary industries and ultimately this would lead to economic inequality. Only these regions are developing like Mumbai, Bengaluru or Delhi NCR region, but other regions are not developing, which means the other ancillary industries may not grow and ultimately this might lead to increase in the economic inequality. The Startup India Action Plan document has no mention of the words like caste, tribe, marginalized, indigenous or the social group, which means that there can be an urban and the rural divide. Technology which we focus in the startup ecosystem might be only present in the urban areas, it might not go to the rural areas and ultimately what we would see is that because of the urban rural divide, most of the concentration happens only in the urban areas and this ultimately means that the employment opportunities are more in the urban areas, and this is not the same when it comes to the rural areas. Added to it, number of other castes might not be represented. One such example is the SCST share in the ownership of agriculture establishments, including farming, livestock, fishery and forestry, were higher in comparison to the non-agricultural establishments, which means that these SCST community people were more focused on the agricultural activities and not focused on the non-agricultural establishment because of the limited exposure to the formal sector, and as a result number of cars may not be able to get the required outcome from the Startup India initiative is another major concern. Finally, we also have to look at whether women are also represented in the Startup India initiative. The RBI's pilot survey had earlier stated that 5.9% of the participating startup in its survey had a female founder in comparison to 55.5% of the opposite gender. So 55.5% were dominated by the men, only 5% was taken care by the female entrepreneurs. The remaining 38.6% had both male and female co-founders. So the startup initiative once again is tilted in favor of the men, and this happens to be another major concern. So this article currently goes on to say, yes, the Startup India initiative is one of the welcome signs, but we have to ensure that these disparities will have to be addressed over a period of time, is what is this article all about. It is this that we have to understand in reference to this article. Now let's look into the next article. This article says protest in Lok Sabha as bill envisages lifting biometrics of detainees. What are we speaking about? The article here is speaking about the Criminal Procedure Identification Bill of 2022. The Union Minister of State for Home introduced the Criminal Procedure Identification Bill, and this bill will replace the Identification of Prisoners Act of 1920. Now the question is, why did the government of India come up with such an initiative? That is because when you look into the earlier law, what we had was the Identification of Prisoners Act of 1920. When was it drafted? It was drafted in 1920. Where are we living now? We are living in 2022. So this particular law is 102 years old. It is outdated, which is why the government of India has come up with this particular proposal. Now, if you look into the original law, which is the Identification of Prisoners Act, measurements were to be taken, which included finger impressions and the footprint impressions. What are these measurements? Let's say, for example, there is a person who's committed a crime. This person who's committed a crime is convicted by the court of law, so he'll be sent to the prison. So once he's sent to the prison, measurements include finger impressions of this convicted person, footprint impressions of this particular person. So the Identification of Prisoners Act basically says that when a person is convicted, all these impressions will have to be taken. One is the finger impression, the second is the footprint impression. But remember, we are living in 2022. The complexity of the crimes have also been increasing as well, and we are not able to push these persons who are accused of crime into conviction mode because we do not have enough amount of data, we do not have enough number of evidences. So what does the government feel? The government feels that measurements definition, which earlier included only finger impressions and footprint impressions, this also has to be expanded because the complexity of crimes are also increasing. So the government says the earlier law was 102 years old, and at the same time it is not able to meet the complexity of today's crimes. So what we need to come up with is a new bill where the measurements definition in the new legislation is also changed. The earlier law included only finger impression and footprint impression, but the new bill says that finger impressions, palm print impressions, footprint impressions, photographs, iris and retina scan, physical biological samples and their analysis, behavioral attributes including signatures, handwriting or any other examination referred to in section 53 or 53A of the Code of Criminal Procedure 1973 will also be taken into picture. So if we are speaking about section 53 of the CRPC, it speaks about examination of the accused by the medical practitioner at the request of the police officer. 53A A speaks about examination of person accused of rape by the medical practitioner. So what do we have is this very definition of the measurement has been expanded with reference to the Criminal Procedure Bill of 2022. This is one part. The other part is, let me give you an example. Back in the year 2009, India's most wanted terrorist and the operations chief of Indian Mujahideen, Ahmad Zarar Siddibappa alias Yasim Bhatkal, was arrested by the Kolkata police in case of a theft. However, he was identified as Bulla Malik. Why? Based on the fake identity documents, and was let off after a few days. And it is the same person who went on to orchestrate a blast in Pune and Mumbai after he was let down by the West Bengal police, and ultimately he was apprehended in Nepal in 2013. We do not have any of his fingerprints or any other documents, so because of which he was let go, and the fake documents were used by him, and according to the fake documents he was let go. Had we had the impressions, had we had the iris scan, had we had other important documentaries, this person may not have been allowed to go, and ultimately what would have happened? We would have ensured that this person would have not come out of the prison, and he would not have committed the crime as well. In order to prevent such crimes as well, what we require is all these proofings, what we require is all these evidences, what we require is all these impressions, which is why we have the government of India take up this particular initiative. So what are the features of the Criminal Procedure Identification Bill of 2022? As we just discussed, there is expansion of the measurements which include finger impression, palm print, footprint impression, so on and so forth. It also empowers the National Crime Records Bureau to collect, store and preserve the record of measurements for sharing, dissemination, destruction and disposal of records. So if there is a convict, so there are three types of people. One is the convict, the other is the arrested, the other is the detained. So which basically means all those persons who are held under the preventive detention law, their samples can also be collected. So who will collect these samples? It is the authorities from the National Crime Records Bureau. Let's say there is a person who is convicted, or a person who is arrested, or a person who is detained. So who will collect these samples? Where will these samples be stored? And that institute happens to be the National Crime Records Bureau. So the record of the measurements shall be retained in the digital or the electronic form, and this will be retained for a period of about 75 years. Additionally, the bill also says, except for those who have committed crimes against women, crimes against child, or imprisonment which is less than 7 years of age, such people may refuse to allow taking the biological samples under the bill. Then this particular legislation further empowers a magistrate to direct any person to give measurements. A magistrate can also allow direct law enforcement officials to collect fingerprints, footprint impressions and photographs in the case of a specified category of convicted and non-convicted persons. Further, it empowers police or prison officers to make measurements of any person who resists or refuses to give measurements. What would happen if a convict or a non-convicted person refuses to give the measurements? In that particular case, it would be taken as an act which is an offense under section 186 of the Indian Penal Code. What is section 186 of the Indian Penal Code? It speaks about obstructing the public servants in the discharge of the public functions. And when the police officers are taking the measurements under this legislation, any other person cannot file a suit against this person if it is done in good faith. Also remember, the central government or the state government may by notification make rules for carrying out the purposes of this act. So these are some of the important features with respect to the legislation. So what is the significance of this particular legislation? The bill will now allow all the investigation agency to increase the prosecution. When you look at the criminal justice system, the prosecution is not that good, the conviction rate is not that good. So what would happen? There will be enough number of evidences that we have now. So this will allow the investigating agencies to increase increase the prosecution, and ultimately this will increase the conviction rate in the court of law. So what are the concerns with respect to this legislation? The bill violates the fundamental rights of the citizens. It also infringes on very important fundamental right, that is right to privacy. So this particular legislation violates the right to privacy, and we do not have the data protection law. What is the security protocol? How will this data be protected is the first major concern. The second major concern is that the opposition political parties say that this is violation of Article 20 of 3, which speaks about self-incrimination. However, the Supreme Court of India in number of landmark judgments has also said that when it is about taking the fingerprints or the footprints for the investigation, it is not violating the fundamental right with respect to the self-incrimination, says the Supreme Court of India. However, there are a number of political opposition parties which say that it is violating self-incrimination principle under 20 of 3. The third major concern is that whenever the data of a particular person is stored by the NCRB, it is stored for 75 years. This can be misused by some of the agencies is the third major concern. So we will have more editorials and columns in the near future. We will take them up once again in an elaborate way. Now let's look into the next article. This article says Supreme Court query on minority status petition. Who are the minorities in India? When we speak about the minorities, currently we have Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, Buddhists and Parsis, and in the year 2014 Jains were added to this list. So at the national picture we have Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, Buddhists, Parsis and Jains who are the minorities. Now what we have is a petition filed by the person called as Ashwini Upadhyay, who has contended that according to the 2011 census, Hindus have become a minority in Lakshadweep, Mizoram, Nagaland, Meghalaya, Jammu and Kashmir, Arunachal Pradesh, Manipur and Punjab. So what is the petitioner asking for? He says when it comes to the national picture, we have the Hindus who are the majority. But when it comes to few states in India, they are the minority. Their strength is comparatively less. So ultimately, since they are the minority in the states, they should be provided all the minority benefits, says Advocate Ashwini Upadhyay through one of the petitions that is filed in the Supreme Court of India. So the Supreme Court of India has asked the Government of India to respond, and now we have the Ministry of Home Affairs which has asked the Ministry of Minority Affairs to also discuss with other ministries like the Ministry of Education and ultimately come up with a conclusion. So in this particular backdrop, there are other landmark judgments as well. One is in reference to the TMA Pai judgment. The other is in reference to the Bal Patil judgment, where all these judgments have clearly said that when it comes to the religious minority, it is the state which has to be taken into picture. As of now, the Supreme Court of India or the central government hasn't given anything concurrent with respect to it. But when we look into the previous judgments, it clearly goes on to say that when it comes to the religious minority or the linguistic minority, since they are on the same footing, it is the state which has to be taken into picture are some of the landmark judgments. So going forward, we have to wait and watch what the central government would say, what the Supreme Court would say, and ultimately whether Hindus will be declared as minorities in those states where they are small in number. It is this that we have to understand in reference to this article. Now let's look into the mains practice questions. BIMSTEC is in need of a framework to tackle the specific challenges confronting the Bay of Bengal region. Explain the statement with the help of relevant examples. Next question. Lack of representation for marginalized groups as well as the heavy clustering of startups in certain regions have led to entrepreneurial disparities. In the light of the statement, discuss the existing gaps and challenges with respect to Startup India initiative. So please write all your answers on the comment section. Peer review, do give positive feedback to your friends' answers. So this is it for today. Thank you for watching. All the best.